Broadcasting now.
And are people coming in? Yes, we have 15 participants.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. We'll go ahead and wait as people are, still trickling into this meeting. So it looks like we have a good number of folks already here. So I guess just for the sake of time, we'll go ahead and start. So I want to go ahead and just start by introducing myself. My name is Anna, Program Director of the UndocuSpartan Resource Center. Have a great group of people here that have been working together to put together this training and who are also here to also answer any questions that you may have. So I'll go ahead and let them introduce themselves.
Great. Hi, I'm Kathleen Wong. I'm the Chief Diversity Officer here at San Jose State University, and I've been working with a task force that was put together by the university to work on issues that we're going to discuss, some of them today, about the DACA ruling potentially coming out and how that will impact our student and staff population on campus. And I'm happy to be here and happy to work with Anna.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the webinar today. My name is Ryan Ward and I'll be facilitating the discussion. I serve as Director of Advocacy and Federal Relations in the Office of the President at San Jose State University. Just before we get started, a few housekeeping items to highlight before I turn it over to Kathy and Anna. The webinar is being recorded, and both the recording and the slides will be shared afterward. We recommend that you use speaker view throughout the webinar today in order to limit distractions that sometimes come with gallery view on Zoom. You'll use a Q&A box to submit your questions during the webinar. There'll be a Q&A portion toward the end. However, you can submit them at any time. They'll be highlighted and then answered at the end of the webinar. And then we will not be releasing the Q&A portion as part of the recording. So just so you're aware, we'll have the presentation itself that we'll share, but the Q&A won't be recorded. And with that, I'll hand it over to Kathy and Anna to start our presentation, and I'll load up the presentation now.
Okay, thank you so much, Ryan. And by any chance, do you want me to share the screen? Oh,
I think
I'll be sharing the screen, so you can just go forward and just let me know when you want to switch slides.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Ryan. So, and I wanted to emphasize the reason, highlight the reason why we don't want to record the end of the presentation, which is the Q&A portion. And one of the key reasons is because we really want to have a space for all of you to feel comfortable asking some of these really challenging questions that I know a lot of us are really struggling with, especially around how do we best support our undocumented students, or how do we best show up for them, knowing that there's so much happening, and also knowing that not all of our undocumented students are being impacted equally. So I want to start off with a quick overview of let me back up a little bit. We have a quick poll. I don't know if Ryan, you would like to go over the question in that poll, or if we skip that portion.
Oh, Ryan, your speaker is off, your microphone. Okay, so here we go.
All right, thank you. So we have a question for all of you here, in this presentation. So if you can take a look at the question: working with undocumented students can create anxiety and doubt for advisors. Which of the following is your top concern as you work with undocumented students? Please pick one. I'll give you all about 15 seconds to let us know, what is your top concern as you're working with students, as you're meeting with them, and hearing their concerns. So the one is, I am worried that I will say the wrong thing and give the wrong advice. 2, I have concerns about assessing a student's immigration status. It is private. I am worried about stereotyping students and saying the wrong thing. I believe that academic advisors should not be asked to work in an area outside of our expertise. And these are all very valid. All right.
So we're almost, everyone has submitted their response. We're almost there, so we'll give it a few more seconds. All right. Looks like the majority of folks have submitted their responses. I'll share the results.
Perfect.
Can you all see the results?
Yes, and I think you know, I know that Anna, I'm sure can share as well, that the top concern, I'm worried that I will say the wrong thing and give the wrong advice, I think is a very, very valid concern that many advisors have. Part of the difficulty is the changing landscape, given all of the things that have occurred, from executive orders that were, you know, where stays were then issued after executive orders to eliminate bans, all those sorts of things that have happened make it very difficult. And so we're going to talk, share information today, and Anna can talk about the other ones as well.
Yeah, no, and I really want us to take this time to really just kind of take in this information and understand that there's really no one right answer. Every student is different, and it's really going to be up to you, the relationship that you build with the student, to really determine, you know, really how much can you open up or talk about these issues in such an open setting, and how much of it is just, you know, providing support in terms of just providing resources and creating visibility. But we can talk a little bit more and also provide you all with the opportunity to just ask some questions. So we can go ahead and close this, and we can go to the next slide to go over the overview of the agenda. All right. So thank you. So we want to go over some information. So first of all, we do want to talk about demographics, provide some historical context as to what has been happening and what is currently happening in the past 4 years or so. How has immigration practices and enforcement changed since 2017? And what has this impact on students? And of course, what are we currently building towards, right? What are we working to build on this campus? So I'm going to go really briefly, not too deeply, into definitions. If we can go to the next couple of slides. So I just want to highlight, I want to think that, you know, most folks here are aware and familiar with these terms: undocumented, AB 540, SB 68, dreamer. These are all terms that we tend to use very interchangeably, but I think in this slide in particular, the term undocumented, AB 540, and dreamer, they all have very different meanings. And, you know, so please take time to take a look at it, and I'll talk a little bit more later down in the presentation. For the next slide. Other terms to also be familiar with is TPS, temporary protection status, which is also a law here in the United States that protects certain undocumented individuals from deportation. Deferred action, not a law, it is a mandate or executive order, has established that certain individuals who are currently living in the United States can request consideration for employment, for work authorization, and also receive deferment from deportation, which is the program that we're currently seeing or waiting to hear about its future and how that's going to impact our students and our campus as a whole. Other terms added on here are undocu-ally, undocu-friendly. It's really to emphasize the importance of folks who are here to support and be allies to undocumented individuals. And then the next page, which I'll talk a little bit more in detail, is the term sanctuary. So sanctuary is a term that doesn't really have a standard definition. Many local communities, especially if you think about sanctuary states and sanctuary cities, really use this term to identify or define measures and policies that limit the type of collaboration or interaction local enforcement agencies supported by the state or by county funding can have in terms of supporting ICE actions or deportation, or supporting, or asking ICE to collaborate with law enforcement. So sanctuary cities and sanctuary states limit that type of collaboration. In terms of sanctuary historically, the term has been used by communities to really define a space or even a movement to be able to protect certain undocumented individuals who are being sought after by ICE, who have a deportation order. So sanctuary spaces have traditionally looked like churches where people can find refuge from deportation. Because there is no one definition, the CSU wants to make sure that we also avoid confusion. So we don't use the term sanctuary. What we do have is we do have procedures in place to make sure that we are protecting our students and as well as their information. So as a campus, we are working to ensure that all of these things that create a safe environment for our students are in place. And we will talk more about that with folks from our campus once the DACA decision comes out, because we really want to share with all of you as to what are the things that our campus is doing to make sure that our students and our staff and faculty feel safe from any ICE enforcement. All right, can we go to the next slide? So in this section, I want to talk a little bit about who our undocumented students are. So I'll start off with some data. Across the United States, there's an estimate that there's about 11.3 million undocumented individuals living in the US. California alone is home to over 3 million of that population. Santa Clara County, let alone, we are one of the most diverse counties across the state with such a diverse community of immigrants. And what we know about what's happening at the high school level is that undocumented students are graduating at a much higher rate. So it used to be that there used to be an estimate that around 68,000 undocumented students graduated each year in the United States. That number has increased. So the new estimate is 98,000 students. And what we know is that in California alone, 27,000 of those students are graduating from our high schools, meaning that in the last 2 years, these graduating classes are also graduating without any work authorization, without any form of deportation protection, such as DACA. So these students are really coming in a very rough environment, right? Not just in terms of access to resources, but also just what's happening across this nation. So we can go to the next slide. So I talked a little bit about why some of these numbers are increasing. And I think it's very important to also, give full credit to the fact that since the early 2000s, we have seen a lot of different bills being pushed through the federal and the state level that really grants students with opportunities, right? So for example, the DACA and the Federal Dream Act. In order for young people to be able to qualify for these type of programs, they have to have had a high school diploma. So graduating from high schools it's more of an incentive now more than ever for a lot of young undocumented people, because that means that down the line they could benefit from some sort of legal relief if that were to happen, and we really hope it does. And aside from that, we also know that there are more efforts across the state to graduate students of color or students from low-income backgrounds. So because of those efforts, we're seeing more of our own students also graduating from high schools. And in California alone, there have been a number of policies, state policies, that have allowed undocumented students to have more access to resources such as financial aid, fellowship opportunities, scholarships, and really just has created a sense of belonging, to acknowledge students in higher education and acknowledging that there are resources, especially institutional resources, that are addressing the needs of our students. You can go to the next slide. So what does that look like at the CSU, or just at least across the California? So we know that in California, the vast majority of our students are going straight into community college, which makes about 81% of the population that goes there. At the CSU, we are the second highest system that has undocumented students. And of course, the UC has, the least number. We don't have data about public institutions. Again, we don't know how public institutions gather this information, but we wanted to at least show how our students, what our student population across the CSU, UC, and community college looks like. We can go on. So at San Jose State, San Jose State, we are home to roughly 530 students who are undocumented. It's really difficult to have an accurate number, and you kind of saw that in the previous slide, just because there's really no way to actually track who is undocumented on our campus. And it's also another way of protecting the students' information, right? It's not information that impacts the students' access to a higher education, but it's definitely really useful for us to know, who are those students, and to also create visibility as to who are the students that are being impacted by the issues about issues around immigration. So our students are very diverse. One thing we need to demystify is that immigration issue is a Latinx issue. While Latinx students do make the vast majority of our student population who are undocumented, the second largest population is Asian Pacific Islander. It is a community that is oftentimes left out of the larger conversation. And also we think about our Black immigrant students as well, and seeing the other issues that are also impacted them, and just our communities in general. We need to be really aware about just how diverse our communities are, and not always tailor our resources just to one certain group, which tends to be the Latinx group. So I wanted to just bring that up, to the forefront, as we move forward with this conversation. Thank you. All right, I will believe this is also my slide. So I'm sorry, Kathy, is this your slide?
I think it's my slide.
Yeah. All right, I'll let you have it.
All right, okay. So Anna, who is an incredible expert, I think, especially on the changing and moving characteristics, I think, of our student population. But she gave you a sense, I think, in terms of the variety of students who are on our campus, and sort of the conditions historically, that we want to emphasize that, this is the context in which students are living, in which you're advising, and also in which students are learning. And so many students, for example, have fear and anxiety for themselves and their family members. And so even though a student themselves might not be undocumented, they may come from a mixed blended family in terms of immigration status. And so they may have members of their family who are undocumented, or have DACA, or any other type of designation. And so there's sometimes a fear leaving home that, especially if the ruling were to come out in which DACA is eliminated drastically, which we don't, it's hard to say what is going to happen, but we believe that even if they eliminate it, they might let people extend or stay until the end of their DACA permission. But a fear of leaving home, that something could happen to your family while you're at school, or you could be detained if you leave your home. And so even traveling back and forth to campus, which of course is now a different issue under COVID, but there is a lot of fear and anxiety. There's a loss of agency because students are unable to control what they can't control. They can't control what's happening with the Supreme Court. They can't control what's happening with this administration. There's a fear that a wrong move, a choice, or a missed document will do irreparable harm that will impact their futures and their families' futures for a very long time. And then also there is the context of racial discrimination and racial profiling, xenophobia, anti-immigrant, sentiment that has really been made a lot stronger, I think, in the last few years, particularly in the last 4 years. And then a lack of financial resources before and during the pandemic. And so what some of you may not know, or maybe you do know, is, for example, the care monies that came for students to universities. DACA students and undocumented students are not eligible for that stimulus money coming from the government. And so the university has had to try to come up with other forms of funding to also support those students during this difficult time. And so this is the context. There's a lot of anxiety, although there's a lot of things that have been going on for these students. This is a long-term fear. So this is not new for students. In fact, it's heightened right now because this ruling potentially coming out may drastically change their status. And so this is, again, ongoing and long-term. Next slide. And then we want to talk about, it seems like it was a long time ago, but it was not that long ago. For example, in August of last year, when a white supremacist killed 22 people in El Paso Walmart in Texas, targeting people of Mexican descent. There have been attacks on Asians for being the source of contamination and COVID-19, and I know that we've done a workshop on that. You also know about that in terms of what's happening here, even in the Bay Area. And then there's been attacks on people of Latinx descent for also being the source of job loss, crimes, disease, drug addiction or drug distribution, those kind of things. And then there's attacks on people of Latinx descent, in particular, for being unlawful and abusing government services and resources. And again, of course, other folks as well are attacked for the same things. But I think the anti-immigrant hostilities, there's been this constellation historically that has come to a head during this time when we're in a pandemic, and also with this ruling coming down. So this is also part of the context. And there have been no changes, no substantial changes to immigration law. And more doors are being closed for many immigrant communities because of the lack of movement in Congress, as well as from administrations in trying to come up with a comprehensive immigration law. The DACA was enacted through an executive order, a presidential executive order, not through congressional action or congressional bill and moving it into law. And so what's happened is DACA is sort of a temporary fix, but people, of course, are here because of that temporary fix. What you need to know is that, of course, people are continuing to be deported. And we know, of course, about family separation. We know about all the things that are still going on that cause a lot of anxiety and also real material fear for DACA recipients, as well as for undocumented students. The additional irony for DACA recipients is because they are a part of this temporary program, they have their personal information in quite great detail for every place they've ever lived, every place that their family has lived. And so there's a lot of information on where they are, and there's a great fear that this information will be used to round people up and deport them. And so that was a requirement for them to stay in the document, to be approved, as well as to maintain their status in terms of DACA.
Thank you, Kathy. Ooh, thank you, Kathy. So as you can see, there is just so much happening that is really impacting our students. And it also really impacts the way that they see themselves or how they internalize these terms such as undocumented, dreamer, quote unquote, illegal. So one of the things that we want to remind ourselves is that our students are more than just their immigration status. Oftentimes students really define or limit themselves based on their immigration status. So for those who don't have DACA, oftentimes, the first thing that they say is like, oh, there's this opportunity, but I can't because I'm undocumented. And so they create these barriers for themselves because they're of these pre-assumptions, right? Or sometimes it's even just the fact that the programs are not accessible to them because it requires a social security number to be able to apply. So a lot of these like really micro things that we may see as micro, to our students really starts shaping how they define themselves, how they perceive themselves. So I think it's very important that as allies, that we remind ourselves that our students are more than just their identity, right? They are scholars, they have hopes and dreams, they have aspirations. So it's really important to get to know what are those dreams, what are the things that they're looking to achieve, and what can we do to help them achieve that. And also to remind ourselves that students, really define themselves differently, and that at the end of the day, to be undocumented is not an identity for many folks. Some may take it on as an identity because it's empowering. To many others, it's not, right? And more importantly, it's not a culture. And we put this one down just because I had a very interesting conversation with a student where he was asked by a faculty to write about his culture as a documented individual, which was very shocking to me. And we had a lengthy conversation, but I think as silly as it may sound, I think it's just a good reminder. It's not a culture, it's not an identity for many. Again, as mentioned earlier, our students come from various different backgrounds, so the way that they experience being undocumented may look differently based on your race, your ethnic background, your social condition, the type of support that you have here in the US, and also how, especially if you came in earlier versus coming in later as a young adult. So experiences vary depending on, your identities. And yeah, so let me go to the next slide. So what does this mean for our students as they're transitioning and really hitting these like really key milestones that we all expect our students to hit, right? You know, such as their first job, their licenses. For our young undocumented people, these milestones are delayed, or sometimes they don't even reach them, right? Depending on the state that you're in. Because we, at least again, acknowledging that California has created a lot of policies that allow well, not young individuals, but allow undocumented individuals to access driver licenses, or, you know, or even be able to get a business license in the state. California has allowed for that, but at the end of the day, a program like DACA has allowed for these milestones to be reached at a much faster rate for our students. So we can go to the next one. So again, in terms of DACA, the way that it really supported our students, right? DACA, at least in California, didn't define whether a student can go to college, at least not fully. It really did, though. It allowed for students to have more options in terms of employment opportunities, better paid options. It provided them with healthcare access, or at least for healthcare access through their employers, driver licenses, in this case, the real ID, which is really, really key in our time and day. And most importantly, deferment from deportation. So once DACA leaves, for many of our students, these things that they were able to achieve with DACA will no longer be there. You know, many will lose their employment, you know, employment-based health care access, you know, loss of the real ID, which will limit how they can travel within the United States. And if they are part of educational programs or, you know, departments that require them to do service learning, or, you know, travel, you know, across the state or travel abroad. We know that at least travel abroad has been impacted, but if the program is not fully reinstated, those options may, I mean, at least that would impact our students. So, you know, if you are part of a department that requires your students to have, you know, to do things that require work authorization or travel, I would say take a look back at them and see what can you do now to make sure that these are not roadblocks that they're going to encounter down the line, or what are alternatives that we can do to make sure that we alleviate some of the effects that the DACA decision will have on our students. And most importantly, they will lose protection from deportation. We know that all of our undocumented students are not DACA. So, you know, practices that we can start putting forward now to protect our DACA students will also benefit all of those students that have been left behind for many years after the passage of DACA. What it won't do, we can go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, go back. What it won't do, at least in the state of California, and it's not going to impact state policies that allow undocumented or qualifying undocumented individuals to qualify for in-state tuition and state and university aid. So some of those programs are programs like AB 540, SB 68, which are state laws that allow qualifying undocumented students to be exempt from paying out-of-state tuition fees. This law, AB 540 and SB 68, applies to also U.S. citizens and permanent residents. So it has nothing to do with immigration status. It really has to do with how long you've been in California and the type of education you attain here in the state. California DREAM Act, also a state bill that allows undocumented qualifying individuals to receive state and university financial aid. That program will not be impacted negatively by DACA. As long as someone has AB 540 or qualifies for AB 540 and SB 68, they can apply for the California DREAM Act. Dream Loan, another program that allows California DREAM Act recipients to access some sort of additional loan. It is limited, but it definitely has benefited a lot of our students. So those programs will not be impacted. So it's important for us as advisors to also remind our students and, you know, just embed it in them and embed it in ourselves as well, that DACA will not impact, you know, financial aid, it will not impact in-state tuition, and it will not impact the Dream Loan program. Now, there's a little asterisk. There might be some students that are impacted by DACA directly who qualified for California residency for tuition. Those students are somewhere around 10. It's really challenging to provide any concrete solutions when there is no state laws or federal laws that allow us to provide more you know, support in terms of in-state tuition. But it is a group that we have to be conscious that will be impacted directly. We can go to the next slide. So for this next section, I'll hand it over to Kathy to talk a little bit some of the best practices and the research behind them.
Great. So thank you. Thanks, Anna. So I want to make a comment. In the Q&A, someone had mentioned that I had misspoken and said that Asians are being attacked for being the source of disease and other things. And of course, they're being attacked because they're being stereotyped, right? As well as, you know, being hit by hate crimes and hate incidents. So thank you for that comment. I apologize for that. I'm going to move on to best practices. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about framing. I know many of you are very familiar and heard about the deficit model of thinking that is prevalent in higher education. And a lot of times it can be very subtle. We can be somebody who believes very much that our students should be empowered, that we believe in their agency and their ability, but yet we can operate in a way sometimes in framing that really may subtly to us try to you know, communicate to students that somehow they are deficient in something. And so the experience of being undocumented or poor does not cause deficient intelligence or a culture of underachievement or inability to navigate institutions. Instead, our institutions are the ones that are really coming up short because we often are structured in such a way that we value and act upon the specific types of knowledge and problem solving skills and ability to move through organizations and through bureaucracy that are based in white middle class upbringings, right? And so if you're a multi-generational college student, you may have access to that information. And so it's really not about whether people are intelligent or capable. It's really about making sure or trying very hard to design our institutions so that we can address these issues, but as well as to be more inclusive. Next slide, please. And so, you know, we need to, where the deficit model shows up, I think, is in the ways in which we can organize a lot of the bureaucracy and a lot of sort of the gates, right, that we have and pathways for students to complete their education as well as to move on into careers. And so when we think about things like gaining residency, campus employment, background checks for internships, even traveling to conferences or financial aid, accessing healthcare, advising, you know, steering people towards career paths, and concerns about, you know, public charge. So the belief that if you use public, not just the belief, but if you use public assistance, it may jeopardize your pathway to citizenship because of a new executive order that came out about public charge. Then what you see is that for undocumented students, each of these things that are already kind of difficult for most students become a lot more complex and difficult for immigrant students, but also for undocumented students to make their way through. Next slide. Thank you. So we have a poll, another poll for you to take. And so if Ryan can launch that poll, what are the different ways in which advisors can convey a deficit model of thinking and invoke stigma interactions with undocumented students? Please check all that apply. It's a tone of voice is one, language choice and word choice, disciplinary major or career steering, or assuming that a student's undocumented status and or DACA status is their only identity or concern. So we'll give you some time.
We'll give it about 10 more seconds.
Okay. Great. So tone of voice. So the top choice was language choice, word choice, 100%. And next was, I would say, okay, so tied for tone of voice and assuming that a student's undocumented status and or DACA status is their only identity or concern, and then a little bit less disciplinary major or career steering. So all of these things, as your majority of you are correct, are things that can convey stigma and unintentionally when we're interacting with students. And of course, most of this occurs at the unconscious level. It usually is not our intent, and even the student may not be conscious of it, but they will feel less than or marginalized or stigmatized or excluded. And so it's important for you to understand that when that occurs at the subconscious level, that student is less likely to bring up issues or ask for help or try to maybe even, check the accuracy of information they have about any sort of process that students need to go through in order to complete their education, as well as to thrive and do well. And so I'm going to talk about the first one, and then I'll let Anna talk about the second one, and then we can sort of take turns. So the first one is tone of voice. I'm just going to go in the order of which in the questionnaire. Tone of voice. It's very hard sometimes. I think that sometimes when we are helping people that we think are victims, rather than resilient survivors, sometimes psychologically what we'll do is that we will either over enunciate, speak louder than we might with other folks. And so what we're doing is we're doing this infantilizing, and sort of use otherese or speakies to speak to people. And you may have had this happen to yourself. I've seen this happen to my mother, who is an immigrant who has an accent, where people will suddenly start talking really loud to her and very slowly. And of course she will just say, excuse me, I understand English, and stop babying me, stop doing that, right? That sort of thing. And so a lot of this stuff happens at the unconscious level. And so we need to be more aware of the ways in which we are working and speaking with people, that we're being equitable in the way that we speak. And that we're not doing a somewhat colonial thing where we are trying to be this benevolent person who is helping a student, but they are students who have agency and have a story, as well as have a situation that we can work with. And then Anna can talk about the next one on language choice and word choice.
Thank you. And I actually had a slide for this one around language choice and word choice, but like I had mentioned earlier, I think one of the key things is to remember that not everyone identifies themselves as undocumented, not everyone identifies themselves as a dreamer. And some folks have very strong opinions or very critical about how these terms have been utilized to create division within the immigrant movement, or at least the way that certain terminology such as dreamer has created kind of like this divisive conversation about who are the immigrants that we need to prioritize, right? Who are the folks that we need to fight for first? And so for a lot of young people who are seeing this and are seeing also how their family members are being criminalized, despite their families just working just as hard and even harder to be able to be safe, to have food on their table, to have, shelter. They are seeing that terminology like this can be very divisive, and it can create this hierarchy of who's the most, who's the better immigrant versus who's not. And I think the other one, which I think it should be said without being, it shouldn't be said, but I think, we still have to talk about it, is the term illegal, right? If a student opens up to you, don't ask them, oh, so you're an illegal. Or even just use that term to describe any human being, right? Like if we don't use it to describe ourselves when we are committing an infraction of, a speeding ticket or anything that, where we broken the law, we should not be using it for absolutely anyone, period. The other one I talk about too is disciplinary major and career steering. And this is a big one for me. I see this too in terms of practices of how we allow certain individuals, certain undocumented individuals, to apply for some of our programs, whether it's scholarships or even just majors that usually requires service learning. So meaning that students are going to have to do a background check. They're going to have to do fingerprint check and volunteer as well. So these are things that we can find solutions to, but many times we assume that because someone is undocumented, they can't do these things. And while there may be some sort of limit, I think it's important for us to, remind ourselves that, okay, if we can't answer a question that requires the legal advice of an attorney, then we should not be answering it, right? So we do have legal resources for us to be able to inform our students, or for students to seek informed information, but at least from our end, we should not deter our students from pursuing a major that they are, or a career that they want. One of the practices that I utilize is to really look, okay, if there are policies or laws in the United States that are really going to impede them from accessing scholarships or programs that would allow them to get the credentials that they need for, for whatever it is that they're doing, then what are the alternatives? Where can they gain experience or gain transferable skills? what are other programs or careers that they can tap into where they're going to be able to do the type of work that they want to. Many of our students just want to help, right? You know, that's one of the beautiful things about working with this community. A lot of them want to give back. So we really talk about what are the career goals, what, you know, what is their major, and seeing what are the resources that we can provide them with so they can continue exploring those possibilities. Because oftentimes it's not about being able to work, because again, we know in California there is forms for people to do, form limited liability companies or become entrepreneurs. But usually the barriers are encountered when they're trying to complete their education, where they're trying to get credentials. How do you pay for it? How do you do research in a lab that requires you to have a social security number or work authorization? So those are really key and important questions to ask. But I personally, you know, would encourage you to do more research or at least consult with folks, right? Like, what are the alternatives for folks before giving a student a final say about whether their major or their career is, you know, if they're going to be able to practice anything within these fields. And of course, assuming that a student is undocumented status is their only identity or concern. We have some really incredible students who know what they need to do, right? They've worked very hard, you know, all these years on their own, and they have these resources. Sometimes they just want someone to talk to. You know, there might be other things that their immigration status is impacting. So sometimes it's just about lending an ear and providing them with support, following up with them. But, you know, listening to them is very, very key. I'll end it there. Thank you, Kathy.
Next slide. Okay. I think we can move on to the next slide. Okay. So I'm going to talk about some research that hopefully will help you understand how students may view entire units like advising units. So there's a lot of research on intergroup trust and trust behavior. And so there's research on how, you know, what happens when students interact with groups like advisors or faculty or departments. And so there's this concept called entitative quality, right? So groups that have a high entitative quality are groups that are seen as unified, and individuals are seen as sort of interchangeable with each other, right? And so advisors might be seen as interchangeable. And so what happens is, if you have a high entitative group from a perception of someone who is using services with your group, if trust is developed, that trust can be transferred to other members of that group. But more importantly, if trust is lost by an individual from that organization, then that trust will also be, that lack of trust will be transferred to other people. And we see this a lot in the research on how students view advisors and advising entities. And it's not something that, you know, we like to have happen. It's something that happens in terms of sort of intercultural social psychological group dynamics. And so it's really important for you to remember that students may have a bad experience, and then they sort of member check, and then they might end up not coming back. And so even though it may not seem very fair, it may not seem like it's very practical, it's something to keep in the back of your mind in terms of group dynamics in organizations. Next slide. I'm going to try to speed this up a little bit. And so, so again, I've already mentioned that trust breaking interaction is likely to transfer easily to everyone, as well as trust building interactions. And of course, what we want to do is to have more trust building interactions. Next slide. So what we know is that empathy builds trust. And so what I don't want to imply is that we're talking about, you know, everyone you know, comporting themselves in a certain emotional way in order to interact with students. The type of empathy, and that's really important. So we do want to care about students. I don't want to diminish that. I think most of us do care about students, but what we need to really back up that type of affective empathy is cognitive empathy, right? And so as an advisor, you need to be able to connect with students, but not produce empathy that requires that student to return it. Right? And so what we're talking about is cognitive empathy, which is deep perspective taking. So you need to demonstrate literacy and details about the student's possible common experiences. And that means that you're not just saying in a general way caring about students. I know it's really hard for students, but you have some level of specificity that indicates to that student that you would be able to understand, and that you would be able to at least have some details that you could provide accurate resources and referrals. Next slide. And so, so what I want to tell you to really distinguish is that you need a strategic relative empathy. So we don't want to confuse empathy with identification. So we don't want to say things like, I know exactly how you feel, right? Because you probably don't, because first of all, you're not a college student. Even if you are undocumented yourself, it might've been a very different era. You don't want to share a similar story to attempt at parallel empathy. Yes, I can remember one time when I was afraid to leave my house, for example. And early studies on empathy and social support, in which maybe some of us as advisors or counselors were trained, were really done on middle-class white college students empathizing with each other. And so that empathizing in this way can feel very colonial to students, right? So I understand how you feel. I myself have been struggling. You're really decentering that student's experience, which might be quite different than yours. Okay, next. So I want you to go back to look at the list that we had, right? So of the different types of things that students might need to negotiate that may be harder for students who are undocumented. So there's some specifics there. Go to the next slide. So, so how do we work with students, and how do we speak with students so that they may feel comfortable sharing with you if they have some particular struggle, because they're not quite sure if they want to disclose that they are undocumented or that they are having specific types of troubles that you may not know about. So generally, it's good to sort of, to say, like, in my role as an advisor, I want to be able to help all of my students. Is there anything I can help you with? And so this like part and the examples are really important. So just sort of being open and saying, if there's anything else I can help you with, and then leaving it there is not sufficient, because it really doesn't demonstrate the level of literacy about the possible things that students might need help with. So if you have any financial aid questions, I can help you connect to a financial aid counselor if you don't qualify for some funding, for example, might be a way to ask. Do you need any help getting paperwork together for internships? Do you need, so you want to talk about going to graduate school and where you can apply? And so you're indicating to the student that there might be some things that you can help them with that are non-standard, and that student is more likely to disclose information on maybe a totally different issue. Maybe they don't have an issue with any of these issues. And so that empathy and invitation needs to be specific with some details that tap into the fact that you're open and you understand that there might be some difficulties. Next slide. Lastly, I'm going to quickly talk about WISE feedback so that we can have at least a short portion of Q&A. So WISE feedback is done from some research in social psychology on giving good feedback and evaluation that motivates students to accomplish, to take your advice, and actually maybe re-attack something that maybe they weren't able to do before. It also increases the student's academic identity and other things. And so the basic parts of WISE feedback are a feedback that gives a description that is honest and straightforward, that indicates high standards in terms of expectation, and then assurance of the student ability with referenced examples that the person who's giving the advice actually observed. And then using that student's name. So we'll go to the next slide so we can get a little more detail. So feedback description. So review the student's transcripts, records of activities or student involvements, and then give blunt, honest feedback, right? So if a student is needing to take a certain course, or they have other things that they need to do, and let's say the student said, yeah, I didn't do this, or something fell by the wayside, you can of course empathize with them specifically. But then just say, you need to be honest in terms of saying, yeah, you're gonna need to do this. I can help you and give you resources, but at the end of the day, this is a hurdle that will need to be overcome, right? And so you're reviewing the standards expected of the student in terms of the courses that they might need to take, or the steps and actions they need to take. And then the last part is really important. So the assurance of the student's ability, and then using their name. And so the assurance of the student's ability should reference something that you have either observed about the student or can gather from reviewing their record. And it can be something very small, right? It could be that, I've noticed from your previous semester's grades that you're able to do really good work. I understand that there might have been some challenges this semester, and you here, Liliana, I know that you can do this. And this sounds very instrumental, but actually it really has an incredible impact in terms of outcomes for students and their behavior and actions afterwards. The next slide. So what wise feedback does is that it increases academic identity. So you've invoked that that student can do it. You've given some evidence that comes from their own performance in another domain. It increases the motivation to tackle challenging tasks as advised. Motivation is comprised of two components, or two major components, cognitive and affective. And a lot of times we don't take care of that affective component, that invocation that I believe that you can do this, using that student's name, really caring about that student. And then it makes the feedback trustworthy. So connecting it to personal data and observations is really important, because students, marginalized students, when they are getting feedback from people who are from the majority, always with accuracy suspect that if feedback is overly positive, it's because of aversive racism. So I want to avoid being seen as racist or anti-immigrant. And so I'm going to sort of sugarcoat some of the critique, right? And that sometimes is not useful for the student. Or it could be in the other direction, overly critical, because I have stereotypes and biases that I'm unaware of. And so I'm not giving accurate information. It might be overly negative. And so the research also shows that when we do wise feedback ourselves, it actually makes our evaluation much more accurate for ourselves as well. Okay.
Thank you, Kathy. You know, I want to emphasize the point that Kathy made, you know, earlier about, like, you know, re-emphasizing the fact that, one, we know the students' names. Just because you know, when I hear the question about, like, how should I refer to a student who's undocumented, their name, right? Again, their status is just status. It impacts how they navigate or access opportunities and resources. But ultimately, again, checking in with the student is very important as we listening to them. And also, like, doing some homework, and I'm talking about ourselves, right? Really checking out what are the other stories that are out there? What are the narratives? There's a lot of really great resources like United We Dream, Immigrants Rising, and there's a lot of great videos online of other young undocumented individuals who have, you know, had that courage to be able to talk about their status in an open format. So, you know, take the time to explore those. And I'll share some resources as well with all of you, but, you know, remind folks that, you know, there are incredible undocumented individuals doing really, really incredible work. You know, even in the time when we didn't think that undocumented people could do the type of work that we're seeing coming out. So this next slide around legal resources, I really wanted to emphasize this one because as we're seeing this DACA decision come down, students and staff and faculty, because again, staff and faculty here at San Jose State with DACA are also going to be impacted. And we know we have dozens of faculty and staff that have DACA. The numbers we don't know exactly, but again, it's such a big program. You know, it has impacted over 800,000, you know, young undocumented folks across the country. So we know that these are our educators, these are our frontline workers during the COVID pandemic. You know, these are our faculty, you know, attorneys. One of the attorneys defending DACA is, you know, a DACA recipient himself. So I think it's just really important to bring to light those narratives so students can really see past just this negative stereotype of what it means to be undocumented. So when it comes to legal resources, one of the really great things is, one, they're free of cost to all students, staff, faculty, and family members. So if there are students, whether they're documented or not, they can also, or undocumented or not, they can also bring in their family members to get direct support from them. So ILD, Immigrant Legal Defense, which is a nonprofit organization that is paired up with our campus, they provide services around deportation defense, DACA, family petitions, humanitarian and trafficking visas. You know, they also work with asylum seekers, refugees, and any other applications around residency, citizenship. Anything under immigration, they will happily work with someone, you know, consult with them for free. If they cannot represent the individual due to the topic, because it's not an area of expertise for them, then they will refer out to a trusted organization. The other thing too is that they do offer services in any language. A lot of them are you know, multi-language speakers, but if they don't have someone that speaks a specific language, they will contract services to make sure that whoever's there, whoever, you know, can feel comfortable in their own language. Another great thing too is that I didn't add it. I added it in the next slide, but we can go next. I included some resources around immigration policy, including resources for family preparedness plans. So the Immigrant Legal Resource Center has a preparedness toolkit, and the toolkit essentially breaks down what can individuals do to prepare themselves for a possible ICE raid or for possible deportation order. It's a very difficult conversation to have. You don't have to be the one to have it with them, but you can certainly refer them to the legal services to talk to an immigration attorney. Another great thing that immigration attorneys do is that, at least through ILD, that they will do a full assessment of the student's immigration status, their family history, anything that may have happened to them while in the United States, to really look at what are other avenues that they may have to be able to seek some legal relief. So they do agree.
Anna, I'm sorry. I'm gonna interrupt because there's a one question I'm sure others have, and I feel really bad interrupting you, but I know that in the interest of time, there are some people that need to get off soon, and so.
Yes.
So I want to let everyone know, if we, and forgive me if it was already stated, these slides will be shared with everyone who attended. So you'll have these resources as well as the live links to hook to the resources. So I just want to say that just to be respectful of people's time. So I wanted to, so there's a question, I'm just going to have Anna answer. Asking students about immigration status, is it appropriate?
There's a time and place. And I think if the issue at hand has nothing to do with their immigration status, there's no need to ask the question. If you feel that if you are referring the student to a resource where their immigration status can pose a barrier or it can put them in danger, then I would probably want to do a little more research. One of the things that I do when I talk to students, and I don't know if they're undocumented or not, it usually comes around advising when they're trying to select, their major, they're trying to find, their career. I usually, or like they're asking about, financial resources. I tend to ask about what kind of financial aid packet do you have, right? Because if they say, oh, I have California Dream Act, then I already automatically know what that means. So we can just have a more open conversation. But I think my general rule of thumb is that if it has nothing to do with the issue, there's no need to ask the question. There are times, because I even face that trouble too, where I don't know if it's appropriate for me to ask, but I do apologize ahead of time. And I'm upfront with them, like, look, I apologize, I'm going to ask you this question. I know it's uncomfortable. You don't have to answer it, but I need to ask for these reasons. And students actually appreciate that. If, the feedback I got, they're like, oh, no, I'm not, or I am. And, it doesn't feel awkward. But you can always ask them for permission, or at least clarify why you're asking that question. And there's another one around study abroad. So I'll clear the point, because I think I talked about study abroad a little bit. But study abroad for students with DACA used to be a possibility before DACA got resigned and before this new well, they're no longer new, but this administration. They were able to seek what's called advanced parole for either educational, humanitarian, or work purposes. Since DACA got rescinded, advanced parole also got rescinded, not rescinded, but it got stopped. So advanced parole requests are no longer being accepted. And also immigration attorneys are not advising anyone to do advanced parole at this point in the environment that we're in. Now, when it comes to Puerto Rico and I believe it might be the Virgin Islands, other US territory, if an individual has DACA, based on what's in writing through a Department of Homeland Security, you can, because it's a US territory. We still caution folks, talk to an immigration attorney before you make that decision, but DACA does allow people to be able to go to Puerto Rico or go to the Virgin Islands, but it's a huge caution from my end. All right.
I want to reiterate that huge caution in that it's often dependent on the officer at the re-entry point into the United States at a specific airport, and we don't have control over that. Mm-hmm. They have a lot more leeway than they should.
Any other questions?
not seeing any additional questions at this time.
I do want to, oh, here's one. Oh, thanks everyone. Thank you. Yeah, I do want to re-emphasize that, you know, I think Anna and I we're very appreciative of the hard work that advisors have to do. Students come to you with a wide variety of issues that you often you don't have the resources yourself. And what we want to emphasize is that we want you to be able to feel comfortable giving a warm handoff for that student to the right resources on campus. And I would say Anna is probably one of our top resources when it comes to undocumented students. But there are folks in financial aid and other places as well. And we do have limited funding and resources for our students and monies that we can use that have come in through various methods that are not federally based that we can help students with. And so it's important to reach out, and we really try to deal with every student on a case-by-case basis. And so that's really important. We appreciate the work that you do. We know that's a very hard time. The other thing is to emphasize that the DACA ruling could come out anytime this month in June. And so we do have a task force on our campus that is trying to address all kinds of issues, including campus safety, as well as continued enrollment. We would love all of our students to continue to matriculate and be able to support them to do that. We don't want students feeling like they can't get an education here or that we are going to cut them off. That's not going to happen. So there's a lot of misinformation out there as well as fear. And so part of your job and our job is to make sure that students understand that they have a place at San Jose State, but also at institutions, other CSU institutions as well.
Kathy, we have a couple of questions really quickly before we go. For someone who wants to enter a specific program at San Jose State and is undocumented, who do they need to speak with at San Jose State?
They need to speak with the chair of the department or the dean of the college. There are, I know at least one program that is on campus that, students have to demonstrate ability to work in the US because of the type of service learning that they have to do and the hours they have to complete. But it really is up to the department to determine, what alternatives are there, how can they make their program more equitable and accessible, but it really comes down to the department.
Gotcha. So this second question is, do you know if you can teach in elementary or high school students or in high schools? Thank you.
Typically, like all high school, elementary, you have to have work authorization to be able to be a teacher. Independent contracting is not something that works for, for traditional teaching.
Got it. And I have a question I wanted to pose too is, say I'm an advisor and the DACA decision comes down and the Supreme Court decides that the Trump administration's decision to end the program was lawful. And a student comes to me and said, I'm dropping out. I'm too, I'm nervous. I'm just going to quit school. What should an advisor potentially say?
Thank you. That's a really, really good one. I think first is asking them why they feel like they can't continue with their education. And as they're, giving you the reasons, of course, highlighting what are the resources that can help them overcome some of the challenges that you see immediately. We know that employment is something that, we don't have control over. We don't have control over federal policy that determine who can work and who can't. But we can certainly refer them to resources. So one of the resources on here, there was a couple of videos around how to work for yourself. So these are programs that Immigrants Rising puts together with groups of undocumented individuals share their own practices and how they've been able to become entrepreneurs and how they pursue these different ventures. So I think, again, going back to the notion of like emphasizing that there are resources, that there is community, and of course, trying to help them build that community. So if that means handing them off to us, doing that warm welcome, whether it be like, hey, maybe let's invite Anna into a meeting. Let's talk to her before you make this decision. I think there's small things that we can do to at least give the opportunity to the student to really see what their options are, really see what their support network looks like here on campus before they make any drastic decision. At the end of the day, they're going to make the decision that they feel is best for them and their families. And, you know, the best thing that we can do is provide them with options, you know, and, you know, I've worked with students who have made that decision very early on already. And the one thing that that I do before, you know, they take off is that I provide them with a plan to return. So they know that there is a way back. If they decide to change their mind, if things change, again, their status can change on the road and they might want to come back. Things may feel safer for them, so they'll return. So the best thing that we can do is listen to them, support them in every way we can, and also make sure that when they do come back, if they do leave, that it's going to be it's going to be easy and there's not going to be any more roadblocks for them.
Yeah, and then also the ruling could come out even if it's against DACA and saying that they're allowed to stop the program. It may have a recommendation that those who already have DACA will be allowed to stay until the end of the expiration of their temporary stay. So for students who just renewed, for example, or employees who just renewed, like last month, the permission is for 2 years, and so they may allow them to in fact finish and graduate. If they're an upperclassman. By the same token, we have employees and we have students whose DACA program status will end in less than a month or in 2 months. And so it really kind of depends. If they say it's over and this is done and everyone now loses their status and now they are undocumented with no status, please self-deport. That's a very different situation than if they say, yes, we're doing away with the program, no more new applications, everyone gets to live out the rest of their current status. That will be different in terms of the urgency. And we need to remind students that, right? So when does it expire? So let's work on a plan and let's hook you up with legal resources to work on a safety plan and a long-term plan, right, as Anna has described.
And we have I think time for one more question. We had one that came through asking, I know the UndocuSpartan Student Resource Center hosts the Undocu Ally Training Program. Will this be available during the fall online for folks who want to continue learning more?
Yes. So the short answer is yes. The long answer is we are going to be revisiting the Ally training because I know they are very lengthy. So for any of you who have gone through it, thank you so much for sitting through those 5 hours. So since you know how lengthy it is, we do want to revisit it and reduce it a little bit more. But of course, look at what are other spaces that we can be in to continue expanding these conversations beyond just the Ally training, because the Ally trainings are just really meant to be like an introduction to the topic. But I know that for many folks who already passed that point, we want to create those opportunities for them to engage. Now, one thing I don't think we talked about it is that after the DACA decision is, the ruling comes out, we do plan to host a town hall, a campus-wide town hall where we will provide more information. So that would be another opportunity for folks to engage. And also it's open to all of our campus community. So that's students, staff, faculty. Because we want to make sure that folks have the opportunity to listen in and be in a space where we can also process what has happened. If it's a negative ruling, making sure that we are reassuring our folks that we are taking the steps that we need to take to make sure that we're supporting our students regardless of the decision. And if it's a positive one, of course, we want to also celebrate that. But whatever it is, stay in tune. I believe it's going to take place the Wednesday after the decision, on a Wednesday after the decision. So we'll come back with more information so all of you can sign up for the town hall, and also for you all to share that information with your students.
And just to clarify, that'll be a virtual town hall, correct?
Yes.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
All right, I'm not seeing any additional questions come through. So I think we could probably conclude if Kathy or Anna want to.
I think we're good. I do want to say too, I noticed that we didn't stop recording, so I think it would be good for us to edit this video before we send it out. So folks, can be assured that, maybe there's questions on here that they felt uncomfortable with, that, we don't put them out in public.
Yeah, exactly. Great point. It had to keep recording, but we edit it internally, and whatever we share publicly will exclude the Q&A portion.
Okay.
So
All right.
thank you, everyone. And thank you to the team here over in the President's Office and the UndocuSpartan Center who've put this together. We really appreciate you. We know that there's a lot going on, and this is like another thing, but you're essential. You're essential to our success, our students' success. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.